Okay, so far we've covered the library in general, so where the library is located, our kind of traditional resources and our special resources like the subject guides. We just went over PubMed. Now I want to go over a database called Web of Science. So you may have used Web of Science before. You may have used it as an undergrad. It's actually part of a larger database called Web of Knowledge, but it's not something that everyone has used. It's not something even people are aware of on the medical campus. I think it's kind of a great resource because it does some things that PubMed doesn't do. Web of Science is about twice as big as PubMed, so PubMed's about 5,500 journals. Web of Science is about 11,700, so again, roughly twice as big. PubMed has about 25 million citations. Web of Science has about 58 million, so again, about twice as big that way too. So, excuse me, so rule of thumb, usually your results in Web of Science are twice as large as they are in PubMed. If you find like 100 in PubMed, you find 200 in Web of Science. Web of Science also lets you do some things that PubMed doesn't do, just by PubMed by design. So it's really great, especially in a case like this, if you've never looked for, we'll use the same example, diabetes in India before, if you're coming to the subject, brand new. It's nice, it does things to really get you on track with your research pretty quickly. Excuse me. So if I want to get to Web of Science, I can just click here, obviously here it says Web of Science. Or I could also go up here under e-resources, databases, and go down to obviously W. Or I could find it on the subject guide, A to Z page for public health. Anyway, you're going to get to the same database. I'm just going to click here. So again, from the previous tutorials, I'm actually just recording all of these in a row for me chronologically. So I've already logged in before to PubMed or whatever I logged into the first video. So I don't need to log in again. Like I said, I can just jump from resource to resource. So when you get to Web of Science, this is kind of their basic search page, as you can see. Would prefer you use the advanced search page to get more control over your search. So I'm going to hit this drop down and go to advanced search. As a little kind of pro tip, there might be some times if you come here and you don't see that advanced search option. Just make sure when that happens, instead of all databases here, you want to be in Web of Science core collection. That's the only way you can get to that advanced search option. So here is the advanced search. So say, for example, like a Google type search, if I just type in here diabetes India, nothing is going to happen. So there's two reasons why nothing's going to happen. First of all, with Web of Science, this database started back in 1964. And in some ways, it still kind of thinks it's 1964. So I just can't type in words like I would in Google or even in PubMed. I have to preface every word with this field tag over here to tell it why I typed that word in. So if I'm looking for diabetes as a topic, I have to actually type in TS equals diabetes to find it. And I can also only do one term at a time. So I can't do TS diabetes and TS. I could, but it's just kind of a mess, frankly. So I'm just going to stick with diabetes. So something else, and I'm going to back up a little bit here. You'll see this in a second. So I'm going to say TS equals. So this is fine, but the thing also with Web of Science is that, again, it thinks it's kind of 1964. It doesn't really understand that diabetes and diabetic are the same thing. Like, it doesn't know that like cat and kitten are the same thing, or female, woman, girl are all the same thing. So it doesn't, mouse or mouse. It doesn't mice or mice. It doesn't understand singular, plural, or sort of different ways to describe the same thing. So you have to do all that yourself as a user here. So diabetes could also be diabetic, right? So if I wanted that particular term. So maybe in this case, I just want to go with diabet so I can get diabetic or diabetes or whatever other possible endings there are. If I want to capture all of those different endings, I can just put an asterisk here. That's called a wildcard. So any letters that come after diabet, any word that comes after, it's going to pick up by itself automatically. A little bit weird, too, that I know we're after type 2. And there are different ways to describe, obviously, type 2. So there's just 512,000 articles on diabet by itself. So if I know there are different ways I can describe, say, type 2 as a concept. So I'm just going to say here TS equals, and then all the different ways I can describe that particular idea. So I'm going to say here, you don't have to capitalize since it's not case sensitive. So I'm going to say TWO, or the Arabic numeral, or the Roman numeral. So any of those that comes back, so this is just going to be, oops, sorry, I forgot the word type here. You always want to capitalize your Boolean operators, they're called here. And actually, I just want it to be an and, sorry. So now it's going to look for every way to describe that type 2 as a concept, because there's quite a few different type 2s out there. So I want to put these two sets together. I want to make my set for type 2 diabetes. So I'm just going to combine these two here, kind of like the advanced search we just saw in PubMed, and say combine. So there's 143,000 articles about type 2 diabetes. And again, I want India, so I know that's the country I want in this case. So I search here for the number of articles that comes back. So now there's 167,000 articles about India. So I'm going to put these two sets together. You just put this and here and combine. And now I get 722. So I actually had, like 11,000 in PubMed, but that's fine. It's still quite a few results that comes back. So I'm looking at these 722. So like I said, there are some things that Web of Science does that PubMed doesn't do. So PubMed definitely had that option. I could look at, say, review articles or systematic reviews, whatever. Web of Science isn't quite that sensitive. You can see I have this review articles here. I have a few options, but it's not quite that same level of specificity. But there's something that Web of Science does that PubMed doesn't do. So it'll go through by, say, the types of journal articles or types of journals where things are actually indexed. So if I click here on Web of Science categories, more options, values, maybe I just want things that come back from public health journals. So you see this, like the fifth or sixth one down is public environmental occupational health. So it's only going to show me articles from what it considers to be public health journals, which is a really nice little trick. Maybe you only want public health journals because as interesting as epidemiology or endocrinology are, it's not really your field of focus as a person in the School of Public Health. So I can certainly do this to limit down kind of more narrowly. Something else you can do, which might not be super important to you today, but definitely will be as your career moves forward. Say you wanted to go to a conference to present on type 2 diabetes, the burden of type 2 diabetes in India. You want to find a conference where people have presented in the past. I can click here on conference titles. It's going to show me of these, 41 results. Right, 41. There are two of these were actually people's conference presentations. So they do actually keep track of conference presentations. PubMed doesn't. They also look at things like textbooks. PubMed doesn't. So it's really nice. So say this annual meeting of the International Genetic Epidemiology Society. Now I know that is an organization that has had people present on this before. So maybe I want to submit an abstract to them for their next conference to see if they're interested in my work on this topic. If I want to go back, sort of like with PubMed, the search history is kind of like the advanced search feature there. Again, now I can just go back and run any of these sets I wanted to. So again, I'll just click here to go back to that 41. So I can also do something, again, the same idea along with those conference titles. I can also look here at granting, so funding agencies. So again, maybe I want to find a grant on diabetes and India. These are organizations who have issued grants before. So from these 41 papers, these are agencies that have given money to the people that wrote these particular papers. Again, I can see more options values here. If I want to, I can sort this. So by default, it shows you just record count. So this Fogarty Center has actually given 2 grants twice or at the top here. I can also, if I want to sort that alphabetically, if it's easier, if there's one that I'm looking for, it's obviously easier to see kind of alphabetically. This is really nice because PubMed sometimes shows grant information, but it's usually just from the NIH. So of these, whatever, I don't know how many grants are here, NIH is responsible for one of them, whereas all these other organizations probably wouldn't have shown up in PubMed. Sometimes they're there, but they don't really go out of their way to try to add, other things. So, there was, I don't know who this Fogarty International Center is, but they've had 6 different grants or 5 different grants they've given. So that might be a great place for you to look. Unsurprisingly, there are a few Indian organizations that have given grants. Wellcome Trust, I think, is another international sort of a funding agency. So obviously this is a drug company, but it's nice that if you want to look for grant money, this is a really difficult thing to do. We get questions like from all the time from researchers. This is a great resource, Web of Science, to come in here and see what other agencies have given money in this area. Perhaps the most useful thing that Web of Science does, though, and again, I'm going to go back here to my search history and go back kind of like my bigger category here of just, so not just from public health journals, but all journals in general for the 722. When you're coming to a topic for the first time, you usually when you have to write a lit review, if you're writing a lit review for a grant or writing a lit review for a paper, they usually want you to sort of talk about the entire history of that topic. So somebody somewhere was the first person to talk about diabetes in India, or maybe diabetes as a global epidemic or something. So how do you find who that person is? So the reason why Web of Science really exists, the person who created it back in 1964, Eugene Garfield, is a librarian. And people ask librarians all the time, like, what is the most important article in whatever subject? So there are some subjects, if somebody asks you what's the most important article in relativity and physics, obviously Einstein, because he invented that discipline, you would point to Einstein. If somebody said the most important article in, DNA, you'd say Watson and Crick because they won the Nobel Prize for discovering the double helix. A handful of papers, the average person off the top of their head, what's the most important paper in that field? Most of the time, 99% of the time, we have no idea. So how do you figure that out? So Garfield was really the first person to go through and say, apply the metric that the most cited paper is the most important paper. You can certainly argue that, but many people kind of accept that. That paper was the most cited for a reason. So it's kind of an interesting metric to look at. So Web of Science is actually designed to do that. So you can see by default now it's just indexed here by date. So this paper here is August 2015. It's obviously going now, oldest to newest, or newest to oldest rather. So here's July. Here's July. So obviously it's by date. But if I go up here, I can change this drop down to time cited highest to lowest. So now when I do that, I see this article that comes back at number 1 has been cited 461 times. Honestly, if a scientific paper is even cited once in its lifetime, that's good. More than 10 times is actually pretty impressive. So 461 times is clearly a lot. So this paper, I would think, just doing a really cursory sort of bibliometric analysis here, the fact that this paper has been cited 461 times and it's from New England Journal of Medicine, this is probably a paper at least to look at, because you could look at this paper and see, what their lit review was. So what papers did they cite? Did they point to somebody as being the seminal paper? Public health impact of obesity, again from 2001. So this is probably an important paper, again cited 432 times. And sometimes, I don't honestly see it jumping out at me here, but sometimes you'll see just doing a search of something. Okay, so for example, number 7 and number 8 here. So the same first author comes back here twice, this Yajnik. So again, just totally casual sort of observation. He's also, or she's also, number 9. So 3 of the top 10 papers are all written by the same person. So you could make kind of an argument that this person is an important author in this particular field. Now this is a conference again, so maybe they rewrote this particular conference paper as a journal article, but whatever. This is definitely a person I'd say worth checking out if they have 3 of the top 10 citations on this subject. Just like with PubMed, I can click here on this article. The author name is hyperlinked, so I could look now for every article in Web of Science by this C.S. Yajnik, which is good. I can certainly do that. But I can also do something, and this is not, by the way, just with diabetes. This is every article by the person. But I could do like I did in PubMed. So I can go to search history here. I could combine now my, type 2 diabetes, or just type 2 diabetes, with that person as that author name, just for papers they've written about diabetes. I can certainly do that like I would do in PubMed. In that case now, that person has 33 articles on type 2 diabetes. Something else I can do, which is nice, so this paper has been cited now 2,000 times, which is enormous, which is great. Again, it's probably a pretty important paper. So something else about this, so maybe in some cases, these papers are a little bit too old. So say this is great, this paper's been cited, this is a paper here from 2001. This paper might be fantastic, but now it's 14 years old. That might be too old. This is even older. This is 20 years old now, 1995. So maybe that is a great important paper, but there's probably been more current research on fetal growth and glucose and insulin metabolism in children in the last 20 years. So another trick you can do in Web of Science, which is really nice if I click here. So if, say, we didn't own this article and you just wanted to see their bibliography, I can click here. In this case, there's no bibliography, but usually where it says cited references here, I could click on this. It would show me their bibliography. But because Web of Science does track the number of citations, I can actually click here to see the papers who have cited this paper since 1995. So maybe the original paper itself from 1995 is too old, but you can see now, excuse me, I can see all of the papers that have cited that since 1995. So there's still a bunch of papers here from 2015. And this again is sorted by date. If I wanted to look at, say, the papers in this list that actually have to deal with India, I can always search within a list of results. So I can just type in India right here in this little magnifying glass. So of these 205 that come back, I have 28 that actually mention India too. So these are papers like the original paper, because obviously they cited that paper, and now I can just limit those to papers about India. So maybe again right here is this prevention and management of diabetes mellitus and metabolic syndrome in India. This paper is from 2009, so it's 14 years newer than the paper I started with, the original paper that was cited in 1995. So you can always use Web of Science to help you find more recent papers than the paper you started with. And you can also start to do an analysis of the most important authors in that field or the most important papers in that field, which really helps you when it comes time to write a lit review.